So again, as you all recall, Dr. Hartanov is the founder of the Collective, and she's an expert in cultures of practice at Google. And she's also an advisor to the American Psychological Association. And she is going to be presenting on levers of change. So Dr. Hartanov, thank you.
Thank you, Sherry. It's a pleasure to be here. Hi, everyone. Nice to see you all. As Sherry said, I have been working in the space of culture change and communities of practice for some time, mostly in the tech arena. And now I run an organization called Collective, which focuses on helping organizations prepare for emergent futures and deal with large-scale change and issues that are at play. So I'm really happy to be here to discuss with you some considerations for when you're looking to make large-scale change. So I have one money slide, and this is it right here. I'm going to speak to 5 different things. Of course, there's many considerations when we're looking at change, but I wanted to boil it down to some of the fundamentals that you could take with you as you're looking at working in these problems of practice groups. The first thing I want to discuss is the difference between emergent change and planned change. Planned change is what we understand when we go through an organizational transformation that is understood. There's a very clear endpoint, and there's clear decision makers and people of authority. This is a very common way that organizations make changes inside their own organizations. However, when we're talking about problems of practice at large scale that are very big challenges, and not only within your individual societies, but within society at large, we're talking more about emergent change. And emergent change has a different way of dealing with it than planned change. And so I want to share with you some of the fundamentals around emergence so that you can consider this as you're thinking about your change practice. So one of the critical pieces around emergent change is that there's not one person in charge. Oftentimes we're working without authority, there's no formal decision maker, and there's no mandate per se. So what we're working with is influence, and we're working much more at the local level. And that may feel disheartening because sometimes when we're working at the local level, we can't see the broader impact. But let me assure you, the way emergent change works is that the local is always a reflection of the larger. So working at the local level is critical because it impacts the wider system. So if you are a champion within your own local community, and then you are building out your network, you are going to start to see ripple effects. So the change may not be all within your control, but certainly you will be impacting the whole system. That's the way emergent change happens. So I want to offer 2 ideas around how to handle emergent change. The first is to keep your efforts simple. So when you are trying to engage in an emergent environment, small acts can have really large impacts. So instead of a master change plan, think about simple moves that you can make within your own sphere of influence. The second piece is thinking about the network and the density to which you are creating an interconnected path to change. So even though the work you may be doing and the moves you're making might be quite simple, if you're able to build a network who are also creating these small, simple acts, then you will see that density is created. And this has sort of a ripple effect, what you could call the butterfly effect. A great example of emergent change is social movements. And in particular in the political space, when Obama was elected, the way he used social canvassing is a great example of how emergent change can happen at the local level through simple acts of going door to door, but with density, making sure that you reach across multiple different networks. So 2 things to remember about emergent change: keep it simple, and 2, seek for density. The second thing I want to discuss is the notion of dialogue. And my background is as an organizational change and culture practitioner. And one of the things that is really interesting to me, and I think critical when we think about large-scale change, is about the story and the narrative. And the reason why this is that we are social human beings who are emotionally driven. And the way that we really internalize the need to change is through story. So when we talk about dialogue, we're talking about building a story around why something matters. And sometimes in change management processes, we jump straight to action. Here's what you need to do without explaining why. Why does this matter? What is the emotional hook? What is this about? So what I'm saying here is that it's not enough to ask people to take an action if we haven't created belief. So it's important that we help people make sense of why this matters. Even if you believe it fundamentally within your POPs practice group, you're still trying to influence others to create that large scale change. And that influence comes from why it matters and articulating that in a very clear way, not just asks for action on what to do. The second part that matters around dialogue is that fundamentally progress happens through conversation. So there's a whole field called dialogic OD, which I could geek out on with you at some point if you have questions about this. But this is about the power of dialogue to create change. So when we bring people into the conversation and we engage in dialogue and connection, that is actually an act of change. So remember that progress actually does happen through conversation, even if it doesn't feel like you're doing anything. And the third thing I want to bring up when we talk about dialogue and conversation is being very thoughtful around who is involved and who is in the room. What voices are invited to the table, which voices are listened to, and how is that integrated into how you think about creating that large-scale change. One of the things that I think is really critical when we're talking about large-scale change and creating conversations that help make movement is thinking about how that conversation is facilitated. And one of the tools that I love that's an oldie but goodie is called the World Cafe process. Happy to share more about that if it's useful, but it's a really powerful way of bringing different people's perspectives into a room and making sense of it together to think about what do we jointly care about and how can we make joint progress. So think about who you're bringing into the room, how you're building the story, and then how that conversation can help you make choices about what is the right next step. Third consideration is the notion of nudging, which has become very interesting, at least in the human resources field, when we think about human behavior change. So behavioral scientists have been starting to realize more and more that individuals are not always just prompted by a story or by reasoning. We're prompted because it's easy and we make unconscious actions all of the time. So one of the ways to think about large-scale change is to those people that you're wanting to change, can you make it easy for them? Can you put them in the path to change so that they'll make an automatic behavior that you're seeking? The classic example of this is when you go to the grocery store and what is in the aisle when you're heading right to the checkout counter? Candy. That is an easy nudge that says, let me just grab that and I'll go. So think about what nudges you can make for yourself, but also for those that you are trying to bring along with you. The second thing I want to talk about that relates to nudging is what we discuss when we're talking about complexity and how to make progress in complex situations. And I would argue that when we're talking about big societal climate culture change, we are talking about incredibly complex things to shift. And the reason why they're complex is because human beings are complex, and it's hard to change human behavior. So in complexity theory, and when I've taught leaders about complexity and how to make progress on complex problems, we talk about the power of the simple experiment. So what can you put into your plan that is a simple move to nudge the system forward. And this goes back to what I shared about the conditions of emergence. Sometimes simple can be really powerful. You don't actually know which experiment might nudge the system forward and get some traction and progress. So try a bunch of different simple experiments and see which one might make movement, which one might nudge the system forward towards change. The fourth component is urgency. So we have a tendency in the US at least, or in Silicon Valley where I spend a lot of my time, to be data driven. And certainly that's important. We need to understand what we're working with, but sometimes taking action and making a small move is the most important thing. So don't wait, do the work now. If you don't make it urgent, no one else will. And this also relates to the people that you want to bring along with you. You may find that this is very urgent and important to you, but maybe other people can't prioritize it. So think about, how can you make this urgent for others and make it important to them as well? And you can use some of the tools that we already discussed: storytelling, thinking about how it relates to them at the local level. So building a sense of urgency and giving people a simple action they can take when they start to feel that urgency, just like you do. The fifth component I want to talk about is much more you as an activator and activist of change. This work, when it's big work and it takes a long time, can be quite effortful. And it can be quite courageous, because sometimes you are going against a system that is entrenched and hard to change. And this is the condition when we are talking about large-scale societal change. So it's important that you think about, how do you take care of you and build that courage in yourself and that resilience. I did a piece of work while I was at Google, a piece of research work, where I looked at people who were going through transformational change, and not only themselves, but they were leading large organizations through transformational change. And what I realized during this research, what became clear, is that when we are in intense moments of transformation and we are leading transformational efforts, we cannot do that without building what I have called stability practices. And those stability practices often go to the wayside when we're busy. They're simple things like making sure that you work out, making sure that you eat well. I had some people share with me that their efforts to make sure they were at home at 6 o'clock for dinner to be with their family was a grounding mechanism for them when they were in moments of large change. So I'm reminding you here of something you probably already know, but remember that you are only as powerful and good and as you are whole and what you're bringing to the table around the change. So think about those stability practices that matter to you, that help you ground and bring you that internal resource so that you can go out and make the change you're really looking for and what you're seeking. The second component of courage is vulnerability. And I really like the notion that the flip side of courage is vulnerability. So these two things sort of sit together. The reason why I'm mentioning vulnerability is because support is encouraged. You're going to need support and in the process of creating large-scale change. So think about, who is it that you can ask for support to be alongside with you, and these communities of practice that you're building can be that support mechanism for you as you're going back into your societies and seeking to help activate this large change. And the last thing I'll mention is that sometimes when we're dealing with really large-scale change, it's hard to see the movement. So look for those small wins and trust yourself. Trust that you're doing the right thing, that you are making progress, and continue to put yourself in the path, because in the emergent theory, those small movements will have grand impact over time.